Hello, the 31st here, how's it going? Today's video is on genderless Pokemon. What are they, how do they reproduce, and some other stuff. Firstly, what makes a Pokemon genderless? Other than legendary Pokemon, genderless Pokemon are generally based around inanimate objects like metal or dolls, stuff like that. Imagine, Magnezone or Clink, Claydol, etc. Also, they don't have either one of the two biological sexes, and as such, can't breed with each other in the normal way. This is likely because they don't have sex chromosomes, sex-determining genes, or, any of the biological differences that accompany biological gender. For this video, we're going to be working based on 6 assumptions. Firstly, that there are genetic differences between males and females in the world of Pokemon. Number 2, that Pokemon have chromosomes. Pretty much just because that's how genes work. That as Pokemon have fixed sexes that don't seem to change, they have sex chromosomes and sex-determining genes. Fourth, except a few potential exceptions, all Pokemon are born from eggs, even genderless Pokemon. It's how we get them from the daycare when we breed them with Ditto, and it's how we get every other kind of Pokemon. Even the 3 legendary birds have eggs in Pokemon Snap. As an extension to this, assumption 5 is that Pokemon can't reproduce by some kind of budding or fission or fragmentation. Number 6 is one of the key ones here, that the level of genetic diversity in gendered and genderless Pokemon are about the same. You can see this through the abilities and stat variations that both exhibit, and there's no real difference between what a genderless Pokemon can do and a gendered Pokemon can do. So overall, genderless Pokemon are basically just genderless because they don't have sex chromosomes or the sex determining genes that accompany them. So now on to reproduction. How do they do it? Well, I'd say it's fairly safe to assume they don't reproduce the same way that legendary Pokemon do. If you haven't seen the previous episode of this series, that was on the reproduction of legendary Pokemon. I highly recommend you go watch it before you continue with this one. A different reproductive system would explain the differences in their numbers, why common genderless Pokemon are seemingly endless in number, while legendary Pokemon, there's so few of them. If legendary Pokemon could reproduce on their own, even if it took a really long time between each leg they could lay, even if it took a really long time between each egg they could lay, because they live so long, there would probably be quite a few of them around, and as they can probably outcompete anything else in the world, they would come to dominate the planet. With these kinds of videos, I don't like to just say one method that I think is correct. As such, I've come up with 3 potential mechanisms for how genderless Pokemon reproduce, and I'll say which one I believe to be, the most and least likely. Make sure to keep in mind the assumptions I said at the beginning, as they're going to be important throughout. So, system 1, one parent reproduction. A single parent will lay the egg that will then develop into a Pokemon all on its own. If by now you've seen the video I told you to watch earlier, the last episode in this series on legendary reproduction, you will have noticed this. And I ruled out asexual reproduction as a possible method for this because in our world, flatworms are the most complicated animals that can do it. Something as big as Lugia would simply be too complex. On Twitter and Amino and in my comments, I've had quite a lot of people who clearly didn't read that on-screen message, helpfully pointing out that flatworms aren't the most complicated animal that can reproduce asexually. There is a method that even some vertebrates can use to reproduce asexually. That, ladies and gentlemen, is called parthenogenesis. It's a method that all female populations can use to reproduce without any males. Generally, it can only produce female offspring, but in rare cases, males can be born too. It's a process that's kind of like cloning how we do it. The mother produces an egg that, rather than being haploid and needing fertilization, is diploid and can start development. Just then I used some words you might not have understood. Haploid means the cell only has half a pair of chromosomes, so one of each chromosome, and diploid means that the chromosomes are in pairs. It's how most of our cells are, minus stuff like gametes, which are the sperm and eggs, which are used for reproduction. However, this process doesn't just create offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. During meiosis 1, the first go through of the process by which sex cells are made, there is an event called crossing over, which shuffles parts of the genome around and in some cases can create new genes, but mostly just changes their order to add a tiny bit of diversity to the offspring. The problem with this system is the lack of genetic diversity, especially based on the assumption that gendered and genderless Pokemon share the same amount of genetic diversity, which with this system just wouldn't be the case. In the real world, populations that use this system gain genetic diversity through the random generation of rare males. They can then reproduce sexually with females from other lineages in order to add some diversity to the population. But of course, this isn't going to happen in genderless Pokemon. So I thought of a couple ways that genetic diversity could occur in these populations in order for this system to work. Firstly, it would be very high mutation rates, but I don't think this is the case as we don't find a ton of dead or defective Pokemon lying around. Secondly, could be some kind of retrovirus or other such infection. Basically what these do is they go inside host cells in order to reproduce. They do this by inserting their genetic code into the genomes of the host cell, so when the host cell replicates, they produce more of the virus as well as their own proteins. When this happens, some of the genes can be left behind after an infection, and boom, there's new genes in the gene pool and a little bit more diversity within the population. This has happened quite frequently throughout history, and even some of your genes come from these viruses. I do have a theory about Pokerus and how that stuff works, but that's for a later time. Overall, this system could be used to produce genderless Pokemon in a kind of cloning-y way, and it would explain the massive numbers of genderless Pokemon you can find. Unfortunately, it doesn't account for this lack of genetic diversity that would occur with this kind of mechanism, and that we don't see in genderless Pokemon. So, as I don't think that is the most likely, we'll go on to the second mechanism, which I believe to probably be the most likely. 2 or more parent reproduction. Without the biological sexes, there's no traditional sexual reproduction going on. No female to produce and lay the egg, and no male to fertilize it. But what could be going on here is more similar to hermaphrodite reproduction in our world. All of the individuals of the species, we'll say Magneton for this example, would be capable of both producing and fertilizing eggs. Both individuals could swap genetic material and have a baby. As humans, we have diploid cells, which like I said means they have pairs of chromosomes. You get one from your mum and one from your dad. Both of these chromosomes generally have the same genes, but generally they have different alleles, which are different versions of the same gene. And the different alleles within a population is what we call genetic diversity. The cells in the human body that aren't diploid are the gametes. These are the sperm and egg cells, and they're haploid. They only have one chromosome. You and your partner will each pass down one of these haploid cells. They will come together to form one diploid cell, which will then develop into, well, a person. That would be a two-parent reproductive system. But in this case, that isn't the only option. Their cells could be triploid and have chromosomes that come in threes, and they could mate in threes, or they could be quadruploid and have gametes that are either diploid or haploid and mate in twos or fours, and you know, the list kind of goes on from there. If they had no sex chromosomes and the genes for laying eggs and producing their, genetic material exchanging particles, we'll say, were on normal chromosomes and were found in every single individual, there would be no male and female differences, and no definable genders. They'd all be the same, essentially genderless. Also, like hermaphrodites, they could also allow for self-fertilization and asexual reproduction in that way. So they could, for example, do one and multiple parent reproduction together. Well, this method explains the amount of genderless Pokemon we can find and their genetic diversity. However, it does push the boundaries on what we are willing to accept as genderless and is, in a way, a kind of sexual reproduction. So, lastly, the final and, to be honest, least likely method, but something I decided to look into anyway, is reproduction with Ditto in the wild. Or, I guess Mew, but probably Ditto. This could work in either of two ways. Firstly, they could exchange genetic material and possibly both have a baby, or Ditto could just act as a surrogate or something. In the daycare, genderless Pokemon plus Ditto will generally get the genderless Pokemon's moves, but they can inherit stats from Ditto, and with an Everstone they can inherit certain natures. Though I'm not entirely sure natures are that genetic. While your personality does have some genetic traits bound to it, it's mostly how you were raised. What this means is when they mate, the genderless Pokemon and Ditto are exchanging genes. What could happen is if Ditto transforms into the Pokemon, it could keep some of its own genes, as it's an imperfect copy of Mew and it can't transform completely, and those genes can be passed on. The problem if Ditto is a clone of Mew is that Ditto hasn't existed that long, and therefore how would this system be a natural one? Of course, that is only speculation, but it is something worth considering. In Kanto, other than in the Cerulean Cave, Ditto can only be found on a couple routes, and on those routes there's only one genderless Pokemon, and that Pokemon is Staryu. I only looked at where they can be found in Kanto and Johto because there's lots of regions, I didn't want to do them all, but what I found is that across these regions, Ditto isn't normally found where you can find genderless Pokemon. Therefore, it's unlikely this is the method used because the distance just wouldn't allow for effective breeding and a stable population. Of course, Ditto can transform and therefore could migrate, but the other systems just make more sense. But we know genderless Pokemon can reproduce with Ditto, so this could happen on top of the other mechanisms. So now we're faced with a conundrum. Genderless Pokemon can't reproduce on their own in the daycare, which doesn't really make a lot of sense if they do it in the wild, but genderless Pokemon reproducing with Ditto in the wild makes even less sense. It's possible that genderless Pokemon need certain environments and the daycare doesn't provide them to reproduce on their own, or that they get stopped from doing so. Either way, we know they can't reproduce on their own in the daycare, which I've used in the past as an example of how the wild works. Either way, I do think it's more likely they reproduce on their own in the wild. Out of the two, I do believe the second one is more likely, but with that system they could have both asexual and sexual reproduction, as they are essentially hermaphrodites. Maybe it's just because I like the idea of a Magneton swapping genes in a little three-way. That's weird, I probably shouldn't say that. Basically, they can all produce eggs and they can all fertilize eggs and therefore can fertilize each other's or their own, and they can all have babies. For legends, I still believe the way I said before works better, simply based on their numbers. Of course, they could do this at a much slower rate, but they live for a long time and they would definitely overlap their lifetimes, and they're too strong, they'd just fucking kill everything. Yeah, that was really long and kind of complicated, and I hope I explained everything well, hope it all made sense. With all that said, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, of course, leave a like. Feel free to leave a comment below. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of discussion on, what you think is true, what you think makes sense. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe for more content like this and a bunch of other stuff. With all that said, thank you very much for watching. Whipper out.